Dan here with the Everydad Workshop. Today we're going to be upgrading my TRX-4 with a Hobbywing Quicrun Fusion Pro. This is a brushless motor and ESC all-in-one, and I'm hoping this gives me much better low-speed handling characteristics, the ability to get torque to the ground but at very low RPM is important for rock crawling, and I'm excited to see what this can do. So this is the box. There's a link below if you're interested in buying this, and this is what comes in the box. So here's the motor and ESC all in one. So it's already wired with a bunch of connectors. So here's the battery connector. This is just an on-off button, and I think this is the program cable plugs into this on-off button, and this is the throttle for the motor. This is where you plug into the receiver. It also comes with some extensions, and I think one of these is the programming cable. It also comes with some zip ties because we're going to be undoing some of the cabling inside the truck. There's a little guide for how to program the motor, and I've purchased the program card from Hobbywing. This was pretty inexpensive, and there's a lot of characteristics that you can tune in this motor. So this gives you a lot of capability to really fine-tune the way your truck runs. A couple other things that I got for this job. I got myself another extension cable in case I need it to run the wiring. And while I'm in there messing around with the motor, I'm going to replace the motor plate with an aluminum motor mount plate, and I've got a steel spur gear, and I might just go ahead and replace the plastic stock spur gear while I'm in there. All right, so let's take a look at what we're going to be doing today. So I'll pop the truck top off. Okay, so here's a diagram of the electronics inside the TRX-4. So today we're going to be working on the motor and speed controller, but other key components in here are the receiver and all of the servos, including the differential servos here and here, the 2-speed transmission servo here, and the steering servo here. I have those represented on this schematic, and it's laid out pretty much where the things are geometrically inside the truck as well. So today we're working on the motor and ESC. So the Hobbywing, rather than having a separate ESC, has the ESC built into the back of the motor. So that's this area here. Then the receiver, the diff servos and 2-speed servos, and the steering servo, as well as the battery is obviously an important component in the electrical system. So the battery has these heavy gauge cables go into the ESC, and heavy gauge cables go out to the motor, but in between there's control going on, and that control is done by the receiver. So the receiver is in fact powered by the 6 volts that comes off the ESC, and it receives radio frequency signal from the antenna and then decides what to do with all these channels. So channel number 2 in your TRX-4 receiver is telling the ESC what to do with the motor. So that is an important connection that we're going to be disconnecting and then reconnecting today, and we're going to be removing the existing ESC, the existing motor, and redoing all the connections for the sake of the Hobbywing. So I will zoom in on this diagram. You can pause the video if you want to have this for your reference. Okay, so now we're ready to dig in and start opening some of these boxes and taking some parts off. So first thing we're going to do is open up the receiver, and there are 3 bolts, and they're not captive, so be careful when you take this off. Another thing that you'll see when we get in here is there's a seal to waterproof this container. And we want to make sure that we keep track of that gasket. Okay, so here I've got all 3 bolts. We'll just keep them with this lid. And here is this little gasket. If you're careful with it, it should just pop out. There we go. This little guy, don't lose that. Okay, and now we can see, if you zoom in, super zoom, ooh, there we go. You can see there are actually 5 channels. So channel 1 is your steering servo, channel 2 is your throttle for the motor, channel 3 is with the 2-speed transmission servo, channel 4 and channel 5 are your diff servos. So we're not going to have to mess with any of those except for channel 2. Okay. All right, so before we take that off, we're also going to open this little side box on the receiver. This is kind of how they seal the cable penetrations into the side of the receiver. It's kind of neat when you see it when you get in here. So what you'll see is all these cables make their way in here, and there's this kind of like squishy material, and on the lid you can actually see where the cables have made impressions, and they kind of squish these 2 sides together to seal up around those cables. So I guess ideally you wouldn't move those cables, but I think we're gonna have to move them a little bit, so let's just do your best to reseal it. All right, so now, just to help us get at the cables that run from the ESC here across to the receiver, we're gonna remove 2 of these bolts from the battery holder, just because those cables run under there. Oops. And what you'll see is once I get this open, there's a pivot right back here, and the battery holder just kind of lifts up, and that gives us some access to get underneath. And there used to be a little zip tie here. I just snipped that. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna chase this cable, make sure we've got the right cable as we go over towards the receiver. And then we're gonna eventually have to disconnect at channel 2. And we're gonna have to get it out of here, which is going to be a little bit of a trick. Okay, so we've disconnected channel 2. Yeah, you can kind of unfurl all this cable tucked up in here. And now we're going to pull this down. Pull that connector out. There we go. All right, so now that cable is out, and we'll have to mess around a little bit. don't know if this connector is actually going to go underneath here. It might be a little tight. I might have to do something tricky to get that out. I'm not sure what I'm going to have to do to get that out. All right, let me mess around with that a little bit. Okay, so what I did there was I temporarily removed the receiver so that I could get this cable out through this little piece here that seems to be stabilizing these two diff servos relative to each other. So I removed this, and now I'll put it back just so that it's in the right place for the rest of this install. May have to take it off again, we'll see. But that's how I got this through without having to cut anything or without messing around with these servos. Now we're ready to remove the motor and the ESC. So before we do the motor, I'm going to disconnect these connectors. So you're just kind of trying to grab these guys and disconnect. Takes a little bit of pull. There we go. Motor disconnected. Take the ESC out. Okay, there's our old ESC, successfully removed. Set that aside. Now, we're going to remove the motor. In order to do that, we've got to remove this top frame here. It's like part frame, part housing. So we're going to remove that, and that's going to give us access to the motor mount plate and the spur and pinion gear. The spur is mounted on the transmission and the pinion's mounted on the motor. We'll see that when we get in here. All right, there's one more. Okay. And up we come. Make sure I keep track of this little bolts. Okay. So now this housing slides right off. We'll put it over with its bolts. And let's take a look at the motor. So the current gear ratio has corresponding mounting holes on the mounting plate, and you can see there are letters that are associated with that gear ratio. So we're going to want to write that down. So C, it appears to be the gear ratio that we want. My new spur gear, if I decide to put it in there, which it probably will, that has the same number of teeth and the same pitch. So I'm going to keep this pinion, and that means we'll be in the same gear mesh. So we'll remember that this is C. And now we'll take, probably the first thing we'll do is take this pinion off. Okay, so you just loosen that set screw, you don't take it all the way out. You could always get it back in, but if you drop that guy, you're not going to find it. All right, And I'm not gonna take these, actually I may have to take these bolts off. I was gonna say I wasn't gonna take them off because I've got a new motor mount, but I don't think the motor mount came with fresh bolts. Okay. Okay, so here's a side-by-side of the new and the old. And you can see the geometry is the same. They're both made by TRX-4, but the new one is aluminum. You can get these in all kinds of fun colors. I think there's probably green and red and black. I just went with silver. I don't know, I like the scale looks of this truck, so I didn't want anything flashy. So aluminum is great, it's durable, but also the aluminum will help to heat sink a little bit of heat away. It's not necessarily exposed to the outside. Well, I guess part of it might be a little bit, but I think the thing there just gives you a little bit more thermal mass, maybe handle the thermal transient a little bit better. All right, so now we want to mount up our new motor, and we want to get lined up. We want to figure out about how we want these cables sticking out, something like that. I'm sticking out the top so they're accessible and less likely to get hung up on anything that we're crawling over. And then we're going to want to figure out which of those bolt holes should we line up with the C's. And I think I'm going to do this guy. So we're going to go kind of loose on the first one, and then we'll get the second one snug down. There we go. This guy down tight. Okay. Now, let's get in there and take a look at what it takes to get this spur gear out. And I may have to take a whole lot more off. Maybe I'll make that a video for another time. I'll get this guy going and then I'll do that another time. Okay, so before we can reinstall the motor, we've got to put the pinion back on. So we'll get the pinion in there, and we will get her lined up, get the set screw lined up with the flat, and we'll just tighten it just a little bit at first. First thing we need to do is make sure that we're meshing, and we're not. Looks like I put it on backwards. Classic. Pop that guy off. Lined up with the flat. Okay. And that seems to be meshing pretty nicely. All right, so we'll tighten that down. Okay. Now we'll put the motor mount down in there. Get this housing lid back on. Now we can tighten this up. Don't want to tighten too much because you don't want to strip out these plastic threads. So when it starts to feel snug, you're good. Okay. All right, at the end of that last clip, you may have noticed I was holding down, or I'd screwed down this housing, and I was wiggling around on the motor, and I didn't like how it was flopping around a little bit. So I'll show you what I think is happening. So this is a new motor mount, and maybe one of the dimension from here up to this arch contour, it might be a little bit different than the plastic housing. Wobbles around in there a little bit. So what I did in order to try and fix this was I took a zip tie, very thin plastic, and I cut the edge, or I cut the tip off the zip tie just long enough to fit down into this hole. And maybe I can fish it out of here. Let's see how good I am. There we go. Just this little guy. Pretty darn thin. I guess I could measure it. My calipers are in the basement. Just drop that in there just for a little shim. And now that'll be trapped by this piece of the housing coming down on top of where I just dropped that piece of plastic in there. And now I put that down. Now I put this housing on. And now that's going nowhere. So I'm a lot happier with that. Hopefully your motor mount is just snug first try. But if not, give that a try. I'm gonna see how that holds up. All right, we'll tighten this guy up, and we'll see how it feels with our new shim. Oh yeah, way better. All right, that's great. All right, now we don't have to replace the ESC because it's already in here. So we will probably want to find a nice place to mount this. Oh, one thing I didn't mention that actually comes with is they've got some double-sided mounting tape. It's obviously the right size for this on-off switch. So we'll do that, but we'll probably have to clean this up. I think more pressing than that is running our throttle cable. So we'll want to run that. I think maybe we'll run back to this same little, probably can't see that. There's a little hook right here. And I think if we get right next to that, we can use one of these nice little zip ties to hold this cable and also this servo cable in position. But we'll wait until we run that successfully to the receiver first. This is where we're gonna have to be a little bit tricky. I may go ahead and remove that receiver again so that I can snake this wire. You know, maybe I won't snake it under there. Maybe I'll use a zip tie and hold it there. And then in order to get into this box, you can see I don't have quite enough cable to get into this box. So that is why they give you this extension cable in order to get into the box. So let's do that first. We'll run this guy underneath here. Out of the way, folks. There we go. Little door there to go through. So I can pull it up. All right, now we want to make sure that we're connecting the cables in the correct order. So you can see we go white, red, black at all these connectors. So white, red, black at channel number 2. Get that lined up. And what am I doing wrong? There we go. All right, that appears to be connected. Okay, and once again, make sure we're going black to black, red to red, white to white. Make that connection. Okay, so we are hooked up. And now that we're hooked up, I'm going to position these cables so that I'm going to try and get them back in the little grooves that they had before to be sealed up by that lid. Bring the lid back. There we go. So that sealing is important. I know a lot of people run their trucks through mud and water and out in the rain and snow. I know my kids love driving in the snow. So the better you can seal that, the more likely you are to survive that kind of thing. But you know, nothing's perfect. So probably don't submerge the thing after you've taken it apart. I don't know, maybe you could. It's a little bit of a trick. There we go. There we go. Sealed. And now we'll tuck all this extra cable back in. Make sure that there's no cables in the way of closing. We'll get our little gasket that we were careful to keep track of. Put it back in the gasket groove. We'll make sure none of these cables get pinched. And we take our receiver housing lid and drop it on there. Tighten up the bolts. Okay, so now everything is installed. I'm probably gonna wait to secure this to the body until I have tested the motor and programmed it. And then once we know that that's all good, then we'll go ahead and manage some of these cables. I'll manage this guy too. I just want to leave it a little bit more accessible while I do some testing. So stand by, we'll get that started. Now we've got our motor ESC combo installed, and it's time to set it up and program it. So you're gonna need a couple things. You're gonna need your radio powered on. You're gonna need a battery. In my case, all my batteries are the TRX-4 connector, and the Fusion Pro comes with the XT60 connectors. So you can find a number of different adapters that go from the XT60 to the TRX connector. I'll put one or two in the links below. Check that out. These are pretty cheap and just nice to have on hand. And you're also going to want to get the Hobbywing program card. They're pretty cheap, and there's a lot of really neat fine tuning you can do. And another thing you'll see when I'm setting this up is the Hobbywing Fusion Pro comes with factory default that will drive your tires in the wrong direction. So you're really going to need this to fix that. It's really easy, but go get it. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, hook up your battery. Make sure that your truck is lifted on some sort of stand, or else if something is set wrong, the thing could take off and shoot across the room on you. Hook up your batteries. All right, nothing's shooting off just yet. And now with the motor in, or the motor controller in off mode, we're gonna press and hold this button until it starts beeping at us. All right, now it's beeping at us like crazy. We're gonna leave the throttle in neutral, press the button once, throttle max forward, press the button again, throttle max reverse, press it a third time, beep a few times and say, hey, I'm ready to go. So now you'll see when I squeeze the throttle, the tires start moving, but they're going the wrong direction. So this is when we're really happy to have our programming card, and now we can get into programming. So before you can program, you turn the system off, disconnect the battery, and now you're going to take out this teeny little rubber plug. If I get it close enough to the camera, you can see there's 3 holes in it. That's for the 3 little tiny conductors that are inside this power switch box. Be very careful with those. You don't want to bend them over, and that'll really make it difficult to connect the connector for the programming card. All right, so now we're going to very carefully line up the connector for the programming card. Just push it in a little bit. Now that that's in, we can hook up our battery again. Battery is hooked up. Now we can power on. Okay, and now our programming card is powered on. When you get the Quicrun Fusion Pro, you will get a little sticker that you can stick onto your programming card, and this makes it really convenient to see the different modes. This text is really tiny. Maybe I can move the camera here. Here we go. So you can see all the different modes. So I'll show you the settings that I'm going to use. I've still got some experimenting to do, but there's a couple that are, pretty straightforward. The first one is the running mode. So running mode you want to have set to mode 1, I believe, for crawling, and that's RPM matching. What that means is when you put your truck in like cruise control mode with the set button right here, then your truck is going to try and hold speed. And if you have this running mode 1 turned on, it doesn't matter what kind of obstacle it comes against, I mean, within reason, or what type of change in incline it experiences, the Fusion Pro will try and hold RPM, and it does a darn good job of it. I'll show some cool videos of that at the end of this video. So I recommend 1.1. Then to go on to the next item, we just press item, and we can see the value that it's set to. This is the number of lipo cells. If you always run 2S or you always run 3S, go ahead and set that. Go ahead and set that to either 2 or 3. I run both, so I'm going to set that to auto. We'll see how well it does detecting what kind of cells you're running. I think it's going to depend on the state of the charge when you first plug in your lipo. So I guess if it's always fully charged, it'll be really easy for it to tell whether it's a 2 or 3. Otherwise, maybe you'll get it wrong sometimes. All right, the cutoff voltage. So I'm running value 3 is what I want here. It's basically disabled, low, medium, high. I guess experiment with that, but they recommend that medium value, so we'll see how that goes. All right, this one, number 4, this is where do you want the thermal protection to kick in? You can either have it set relatively low at 105C or a little bit higher at 125C. I think this is the kind of thing where you want to be on the safe side unless it really kicks in a lot and you don't think it's reasonable. So I set that to 1. Number 5, this is motor rotation direction. This is important to change for your TRX-4. Set this to 2. Now it's in clockwise mode. So you saw I changed the value and then hit OK and it's saved. Now when I squeeze the trigger, it'll go forward. Number 6 is the BEC voltage. So for a Traxxas TRX-4, if you run this at 7.4 volts, you could burn out your receiver, you could burn out your differential and speed servos, so you don't want to do that. Drag brake force. This 6 is the default. That's one that you can really experiment with. Some people want the truck to hold them stopped on a steep incline. Some people want the truck to gradually roll down the hill very slowly. So you can tune that. That's definitely going to be dependent on the weight of your truck, the type of your truck, gear ratios, and all that. 8, the drag brake rate. So this is the rate at which that brake is applied. Default is 5. I think that's pretty good. I don't know. I might set that a little bit lower. Just keep me from flipping over on a downhill. I don't know. Experiment with it. The number 9, the max reverse force. I'm going to lower that. I really don't like it when I'm going to back up and the truck seems to like jerk. I think some of it is my ability to reverse thrust with my finger. I feel like I'm really good on the forward, and then when I go to reverse it, I like goof it up. So I'm not sure if that's going to help me, but I'm going to try that out. Maybe I'll even lower it down to 1 just to see if I can prevent the truck from jerking backwards by limiting the reverse force. So I'll save that. 10, the max brake force. So 6 is the default, and it looks like that's 60%. So let's see how that goes. Again, you can experiment with that one. This is a lot of the neat tuning you can do. 11 is RPM decrease rate. This is one, I guess they recommend setting it really low, but if you have some reason to set it a little bit higher, give it a shot. 12, punch. It comes set with a relatively high punch value. This is kind of like a, I don't know, rate of acceleration or a rate of increase in RPM. I'd like that to be a bit lower for the sake of a rock crawler. So I'm going to set that to 3 and then probably experiment a lot from there. And then 13 is the neutral range. Neutral range is kind of how much motion you need on the throttle before the truck will start reacting. Comes set to 8%. I'm going to set this to the lower 6%. I think I'm pretty good with my forward throttle control, so let's see how that goes. Okay, so that's all the values. So every time you've hit OK going through that, you've been storing. So now you can just unplug and very carefully put this seal back in. Just make sure all the holes are nicely lined up. I feel like it goes in better one way than the other, so give that a try. Don't force it until it feels like it's sliding nicely. All right, now we're all programmed. Let's tuck some of these cables away and take the truck out on the rocks.